So this is the 13-inch M1 MacBook Pro from 2020 with 8 gigabytes of RAM and 512 gigabytes of storage in space gray, and it cost me $1,449. Adding AppleCare cost me another $215. After tax, that comes out to $1,668 for this laptop. I've been using it for 3 years, and the question that's been on my mind is, how long should a MacBook last you? So this is a pretty classic design, as all of the MacBook Pros are. They're pretty squared off. It looks great from the outside, as it always has, and nothing has really changed with this model. The space gray is actually pretty barely noticeable, and I'm a big fan of the more saturated, deeper, darker colors. The bezels on the display are standard for a MacBook from 2020. This was before the redesign with the notch display in late 2021. And the keyboard is nice, as Apple finally went back to their Magic Keyboard, or more substantial switches instead of the thin butterfly switches that they had that plagued the MacBooks from the late 2010s. My previous MacBook before this was a 12-inch MacBook from 2017, the super thin 2-pound notebook that they had, and those switches were constantly getting stuck, and I haven't had that issue with these. Instead of flooding you with statistics, Geekbench scores, and other performance jargon that honestly might not mean much and is hard to contextualize anyway, I just want to talk about my subjective experience with this laptop and how it's held up in my day-to-day life. I've had this laptop for a majority of my time in medical school, and I've been using it more recently to start up this YouTube channel, and I want to talk about how it's held up in that regard. Studying as a med student is primarily reliant on web-based apps and softwares like Anki and Complete Anatomy. No surprise, the M1 chip in this MacBook Pro has handled both of those things and more completely fine for studying. I've never felt held back in the studying department for medicine with this laptop. When it comes to research, I've even had to remote into Windows desktops, and I've been able to get through a whole day of doing research without even noticing the laptop slowing me down. I will say one thing that really bothered me about using this laptop with the M1 chip, and this wasn't fixed recently until the M3s, and it's still, I don't think it's completely fixed, is that the fact that the M1 chip cannot support 2 external displays. Even if the laptop's open or closed, it doesn't matter. It can't support 2 external displays, which really limits you, especially if you work from home. During my research year, I did work from home a lot, and it would be nice to be able to use 2 displays that are bigger. It's better for ergonomics, it's better for productivity, and it's a shame that a laptop in 2020 that cost me nearly $2,000 couldn't support 2 external displays despite having the Pro moniker in its name. Now, here's where it gets interesting. In the latter half of medical school, I started to create content, first on TikTok and then gradually on YouTube, and I started using my MacBook to edit it. I used to use the app LumaFusion, which is actually an iPad app that costs $10, but I just ported over the iPad version onto Mac and used that, and it was okay, but it was pretty slow and buggy. And then I tried iMovie, which was fine. It comes included with your MacBook, but I felt like it wasn't feature-rich enough for the things that I wanted to do with my videos. And granted, none of the videos that I make are necessarily studio productions. There's just some things that I want that aren't in iMovie. And so I decided to take the jump to Final Cut Pro and Motion 5, which are Apple's apps for both graphics and video editing. And in my experience, this MacBook, as early as 2022, when I first did the free trial of Final Cut Pro, started to show its age of 8 gigabytes of RAM. I went with the base RAM spec because when I bought this laptop, I didn't anticipate wanting to create videos with it. And what stood out to me was that the moment I needed something a little bit more advanced out of my MacBook Pro, it started to hiccup with Final Cut Pro, and I ran out of storage really quickly despite being, half a terabyte, and I ran out of RAM despite having 8 gigabytes of RAM. I thought that was good enough in 2020. I was wrong. This issue of RAM and storage management has only worsened as I've continued to rely more on Final Cut Pro. It's to the point now where I can really only get a 10-minute video out as I shoot in 4K on my iPhone, and it demands a huge amount of storage. One of the tricks that Apple uses to help free up RAM space or increase the computing powers and memory capabilities of their MacBooks is they use something called swap. From what I understand, when your computer runs out of its native RAM, it can rely a little bit more on the SSD because of the way the components are configured. Now, this is just a limitation of 8 gigabytes of RAM in 2024. It's ridiculous that Apple engineers their laptops in a way that prevents you to upgrade the internal components if your use cases change, as they did for me. Now, of course, it's an excellent business strategy because then that user who suddenly has an increase in their demands is back in the market for a new laptop. And if they love Mac, they're just going to get a new one. But it's a little bit of a limitation for us consumers because you have to have the foresight to know what you're getting into, and you can't always do that. Not to mention that Apple charges a lot for their internal storage upgrades off the jump. And so you have to take that extra $600, sometimes even $1,000 investment on the chin for a use case that you might never actually use. And most sensible consumers wouldn't do that. So you're kind of in this catch-22 where you try and save a little bit of money and then end up underperforming in the future with your laptop, or you go crazy in the beginning and then you never even come close to maxing it out and then you wasted all that money in the first place. Of course, it's a great business decision, but consumers like us definitely suffer a little bit here. The battery life is probably the biggest endorsement to how good the M1 chip is in terms of efficiency and power. I was routinely getting a day or two out of this laptop, and even still now I can still get a whole day despite my battery capacity being closer to 80%. I'd say that if your laptop is spec'd appropriately for your workflow, then you could just probably pay for the $249 battery replacement from Apple and keep this thing going for however long you can get out of it. There's no need to upgrade from a performance standpoint if the laptop is meeting your needs, right? So this laptop has some legacy features on it, I guess I can say that now. It has the touch bar, which surprisingly I actually loved. It's for a display that's on a computer, it's relatively rare that it malfunctioned. It was always responsive. And it actually added some functionality in some situations where it was actually genuinely helpful beyond just having a function row at the top of the computer keyboard. I really liked using it for formatting in Apple Notes. You guys know how much I use that software and rely on it for my day-to-day needs. It's really helpful in Final Cut Pro with some shortcuts. And it's also helpful in Spotify or YouTube when you're just scrubbing through a video trying to get from point A to point B. I'm not completely sure why they got rid of it. I agree that the potential use cases are small, and the fact that you have to pick your finger up and be very precise by picking where you want to touch is a little inconvenient. But I thought that when it did come in handy, it was genuinely useful.
I mean, what is this really? Super grainy. The moment that I turn the laptop to the side, excuse all the filming equipment, like this, look at that. Look at that quality difference. It gets extremely grainy and can't really do an interview like this.
When I was interviewing for residencies this fall, I had to get the Belkin attachment for continuity camera with the iPhone so that I wouldn't have an embarrassingly grainy picture during my residency interviews. And anytime you have a job interview or an interview for a program that you're going to spend 5 years at or more, you want to make a good first impression, and camera quality, unfortunately, is part of that first impression. Okay, so to answer the question I asked at the beginning of this video, how long should a MacBook last you? Well, I think the answer that we want to hear is about 5 to 7 years. At least that's how long they used to last. For me, in this case, it lasted me 3 years. And if we're being really honest about the performance issues, I only made it a year before I ran into issues with this laptop. In my situation, of course, it's a reflection of the inadequacy of the specs rather than the failure of the machinery. But that's still a significant problem that I have to deal with, and now I have to shell out extra money for a new laptop. I think there are 2 points that I have in making this video. The first is that workflows matter, and the second is that with the M series chips, what does the word Pro really even mean anymore? If it looks like a Pro and it's literally called a Pro, it should act like one, but in my case, it didn't. Now you could argue that this is my lack of awareness of what specifications are needed for video editing, but again, I didn't even know I was going to be doing this in the future, but I thought having a Pro laptop would put me in a good position. The other kind of variable in all of this is that Apple won't let you upgrade the internals of a laptop after it's bought. This puts a ton of pressure on us to figure out what exactly we want the laptop to do 3, 4, 5 years down the line. And as you can see in my case, that's really hard to do sometimes. My advice is this: if you have relatively consistent needs, if you're farther along in your career or you're more settled in what you want to do, then I think you can get a laptop and be confident that it'll last you 5 to 7 years. But if you're younger in college or in graduate school like I am, and I was when I bought this, spec your laptop up 1 tier of RAM and storage than you think you need, so that when your needs do change, if they do, you're good. Of course, all of this only applies if you can really afford the RAM upgrades. If you're in a situation where you can't do that, then of course go with what works for you and what you can afford. But this is just my opinion and how I would approach it if I had all of this understanding now. So let me know down below if you've had this thought process or been in a similar situation when buying a new laptop. And if you found this video relatable or you learned something, then definitely subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.